Objection, the chair is authorized to declare recess of the subcommittee at any time. The subcommittee is meeting today to hear testimony on unleashing the golden age of American energy dominance. Under the committee rule 4F, any oral opening statements at hearings are limited to the chairman and the ranking member. I therefore ask unanimous consent that all other members' statements be made part of the hearing record if they are submitted in accordance with committee rule 3.0. Without objection, so ordered. I ask unanimous consent the following members be allowed to sit and participate in today's hearing: the gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Stauber, the gentleman from West Virginia, Mr. Moore. Without objection, so ordered. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. Good morning, everyone. I want to thank our witnesses for being here today. I'm excited about the opportunity to have a conversation about unleashing the golden age of American energy dominance. Now, while we may have some disagreements across the aisle about the best path forward for making energy in America great again, I do think we can agree that making energy prices more affordable for all Americans is something we can all get behind. With that being said, the Biden administration's unprecedented 4-year war on American energy made it nearly impossible to produce domestic energy on public lands and was nothing short of catastrophic. This catastrophe was made even worse by frivolous and vexatious litigation intended to not only slow energy exploration and production to a halt, but also drive the cost of energy projects up by millions of dollars. Right now, we have a great opportunity to unlock the vast potential of all American energy sources, from onshore and offshore oil and gas leases to permitting new mines right here in America to investing in natural gas projects, including in my home state of Georgia. These are important steps that work not only to drive down the cost of energy for households, but also to provide a reliable source of income for both state and federal governments. For example, the projected cost of energy consumption in Georgia per capita in 2025 is $1,614. By enacting policies that produce more energy here in the United States, energy prices will begin to go down. According to some estimates, households in Georgia could save $484 per year with a 10% decline in energy cost. With a 50% price decline in energy cost, that number goes up to $2,420 per household. Now, these are real numbers in the pockets of Georgia citizens, and these numbers are achievable. Another interesting example, Georgians will spend $17.8 billion in total energy consumption this year. Enacting more proactive domestic energy policies would drive down the cost of energy for families at home in Georgia, cutting costs by as much as $8.9 billion. Now, if we look at both onshore and offshore lease sales and the impact of these leases on the federal revenue, the numbers are incredible. For example, a scenario in which we lease just 2 times the number of baseline sales, which is not much, that increases the receipts of the federal government by $44 billion. Now, as we continue to expand the number of those onshore and offshore leases, that number could go up as much as $271 billion. Again, this is a very achievable scenario. Increasing revenue to the federal government isn't limited to the production of oil and gas. Minerals play a critical role here as well. Georgia's natural resources include dozens of industrial mines, each of which have thousands of uses. And though minerals are mined in 133 of Georgia's 159 counties, demand for minerals will continue to rapidly outstrip supply and production absent major change. This is fueled by regular market growth as well as investments in new technologies and data centers. With the amount of state and federal land available throughout the United States, including in my home state of Georgia, we have a great opportunity to invest in sustainable, environmentally friendly mining practices here at home in a way that will also fortify our federal estate. Now is the time to prioritize permitting these critical mining, oil, and gas investments here at home, which will allow not only a great return on federal revenue, but also provide for a more dependable and robust energy supply chain upon which we depend on every day. I hope today that we can have a robust and insightful discussion from those whose lives are impacted daily by decisions that have been made here in Washington, and look forward to working with the new administration on policies that improve the lives and pocketbooks of all Americans in the future. With that, I yield to the ranking member for her opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all our witnesses for being here today. Today's hearing on so-called energy dominance presents us with a clear choice. We double down on fossil fuels that pollute our communities and drive up costs for working Americans, or invest in a clean energy future that creates jobs, strengthens national security, and lowers household energy bills. For decades, the fossil fuel industry has devastated frontline communities, leaving them with exorbitant health costs and environmental cleanup bills. Pollution disproportionately harms low-income and minority communities, leading to higher rates of asthma, cancer, and other life-threatening illnesses. And as a pulmonary critical care physician who's taken care of these folks, I can attest that this is not made-up fantasy. This is real and experienced every day across this country. In Louisiana's Cancer Alley, a predominantly Black community, cancer risks are nearly 50 times the national average due to the concentration of oil refineries and chemical plants. Indigenous lands are eroding from pipeline infrastructure, and historic Black neighborhoods have been abandoned due to toxic contamination. And these are exactly the kinds of costs that are ignored by most economic models that are supposed to estimate the financial impact of oil and gas extraction. The majority's witnesses are plugging unrealistic numbers, backed by rosy assumptions, into economic models to tell a story about how digging up all the oil and gas under public lands will be great for this country. Their economic models do not consider the costs of causing or exacerbating extreme weather events like Hurricane Helene. They ignore the rising healthcare costs from pollution-related illnesses. They fail to account for the fact that industries, consumers, and global markets are shifting toward clean energy, not out of ideology, but because it is increasingly the more affordable, stable, and secure option. They sidestep the fact that the volume of increases in extraction of oil and gas that they plug into the model are not even feasible for a host of reasons that have nothing to do with the policies they are asking for. Don't take my word for it. This is the CEO of ExxonMobil, Darren Woods, in November 2024. Their economic models do not consider the cost of causing or exacerbating extreme events. Yep, sorry. His quote, sorry. I don't think the level of production in the US is being constrained by external restrictions. I'm not sure how drill, baby, drill translates into policy. Certainly, we wouldn't see a change based on a political change, but more on an economic environment. I don't think there's anybody out there that's developing a business strategy to respond to a political agenda. That's the end of his quote. Why the emphasis on these models? Ahead of a massive reconciliation bill, this subcommittee is trying to inflate the economic impact of unrestrained drilling on our most cherished lands. They want the Congressional Budget Office, who estimates how much our legislation will cost, to think their estimates are real. If the CBO can be convinced that drilling would make a lot of money for the federal government, Republicans would be allowed to give even more of your hard-earned taxpayer dollars to big oil. Even the promise of fossil fuel-driven job growth rings hollow. Over the past decade, US oil and gas employment has declined by approximately 40%. At the same time, taxpayers are footing the bill for big oil. The fossil fuel industry receives $15 billion in subsidies each year. And what do we get in return? Price manipulation, collusion with foreign cartels, and rising energy costs for American families. The Trump administration's energy policies have cost America dearly. Since Trump's election, over 50,000 clean energy jobs have been lost, delayed, or threatened, along with $56.3 billion in new investments. And House Republicans are working to gut the Inflation Reduction Act's clean energy tax credits, the very incentives that have spurred a clean energy manufacturing boom, creating over 400,000 jobs and saving Americans $8.4 billion in energy costs in just 1 year. And we're already seeing the consequences. Utility companies in 16 states have hiked rates, some by as much as $32 per month, due to the uncertainty surrounding clean energy investments. If Republicans succeed in rolling back these tax credits, energy bills will increase by $32 billion over the next decade, costing families over $100 per year on average. There is a better way. Investing in clean energy strengthens national security, drives economic growth, and delivers real savings for consumers. In 2023, global clean energy investments surpassed $1.7 trillion, outpacing fossil fuel investments for the first time. The American people deserve real solutions, not more handouts to the oil and gas industry. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
I now recognize the full committee chair, Mr. Westerman, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses for being here today. You know, the importance of our natural resources and the role they play in America's energy supply is no surprise to my colleagues here who are in this room, and I would say to really anybody that's in this room. And we all know that the demand for power is only growing. We're seeing 5-year growth load projections increasing by a staggering 550% since 2022. And I think if you looked at this data objectively, you could see that we're facing an energy crisis if we don't do something different from what we've been doing. We need an all-hands-on approach to producing as much new energy as we can. This explosion is being driven by data processing, by AI, and by manufacturing here in the United States. We cannot risk falling behind other countries such as China as we compete in these growing sectors. It's amazing the amount of energy that some of this data processing takes, and quite frankly, I'm for renewable energy. I'm for any kind of energy we can put on the grid, but it has to be in sufficient amounts that we can meet our needs and not drive the cost so high that the American consumers can't afford energy anymore. It's foundational to our economic growth and to our national security. We do have a solution, and part of that solution is the fact that we have abundant natural resources here that we can use to grow the energy sector. And the benefits of releasing American energy exploration and production definitely extends to our economy. There are some current economic models that indicate that domestic energy production using emerging technologies and sound federal policy decisions could result in $25 trillion in U.S. GDP growth by 2050 and the annual creation of more than 5 million jobs. And I will remind everybody that since the 1960s, the federal revenue from coming from taxes is about 17.5% of the GDP. So if you see a $25 trillion increase in economic activity, that means there's going to be more money flowing into the federal government to help balance the budget. There's a debate. What's going to happen with prices as energy production increases? It all comes back to that simple supply and demand curve. How much energy can we produce for the demand that's out there? And if we don't keep up with the demand, obviously the price is going to go higher. So there's a lot of economic data that's been presented in the testimonies today. I look forward to hearing that and to debating it and using that to help drive the policies that we'll be looking at in the Natural Resources Committee as we look at different ways to bolster new energy production and ways to meet the demand that keeps America competitive, that keeps energy prices reasonable for consumers, and that really looks out for the best interest of our country and for the future of the global economy and our national security. So again, thank you to the witnesses for being here today. I look forward to the discussions, and I yield back.
Thank you. I will now introduce our witnesses. We have Mr. Matthew Jensen, who is Director of Office for Fiscal and Regulatory Analysis, the American First Policy Institute in Washington, D.C. Mr. Glenn Swedenham, Distinguished Fellow, Energy Policy Research Foundation in Washington, D.C. Ms. Megan Gibson, Senior Attorney, Southern Environmental Law Center here in Washington. Dr. Kevin Daratna, Acting Director, Chief Statistician, and Senior Research Fellow with the Heritage Foundation here in Washington, D.C. Let me remind the witnesses that under committee rules, you must limit your oral statement to 5 minutes, but your entire statement will appear in the hearing record. To begin your testimony, please press the on button with the microphone. We use timing lights. When you begin, the light will turn green, and at the end of 5 minutes, it will turn red. And I will ask you to please complete your statement. The chair now recognizes Mr. Jensen for 5 minutes.
Chairman Collins, Chairman Westerman, Ranking Member Dexter, members of the committee, thank you for inviting me. Let's begin today by confronting what's a hard economic reality of our current circumstances, which is that after 4 years of the prior administration's policies, many Americans are still finding that everything they buy is far too expensive. Yes, the 12-month core inflation rate fell below 3% in February 2025 data. And yes, core inflation reached the lowest level since May 2021. But the level of prices, not the rate of increase, is still more than 20% above where it was in January 2021 when President Biden took office. Affordability for the American public demands and is receiving serious attention from the second Trump administration and this 119th Congress. Where we can bring down the prices of energy and other essential inputs to daily life, those opportunities should be pursued with vigor. President Trump has targeted a major reduction in energy prices for consumers. And energy prices are baked into just about every good, product, and service that Americans consume. A reduction in energy prices would lead to strong downward pressures across all the prices in the economy. It takes energy to get seed into the ground, to get grains and machines to the factory, and to get your Cheerios to the grocery store. A study from Dr. Parna Mather indicates an indirect energy cost multiplier of nearly 2. So for every dollar of direct energy costs that families face, they bear another dollar in indirect costs. A BCG study puts that multiplier at 3. What does this all mean for the American family? Let's look at the numbers if energy prices come down by 10 or 50% compared to the baseline, starting with just the direct costs. In Arizona, reducing energy costs by 10% would mean statewide household savings of $1.7 billion. In Colorado, the number is 1.4, and in Oregon, it's 1. The average household would save $700 in Arizona, $720 in Colorado, and $650 in Oregon. That's every year. And what if we reduced energy costs by 50%? The average household would save $3,500 in Arizona, $3,600 in Arizona, $3,300 in Oregon. Indirect savings from energy price reductions could double to triple these estimates. Now let's turn to the fiscal effects of onshore and offshore oil and gas leasing. And here I rely on a modeling framework developed by Dr. James Brohl, an economist, energy expert, and author of the excellent book, Regulation and Economic Growth. It's been applied by my colleague, Dr. Weifeng Zhang, an economist with the Office for Fiscal and Regulatory Analysis. The model is freely available on GitHub. You can access it, you can interrogate it, you can use it for your own estimates. Starting from an appropriate baseline of the previous administration's activities, the model shows that increasing onshore leasing to the past decade high and offshore leasing to 3 sales per year could raise up to $58 billion over 10 years. A more aggressive reform to increase onshore leasing to 2 times the past decade high and offshore leasing to 10 sales per year could raise up to $173 billion over 10 years. And a realistic but more aggressive still reform to increase onshore leasing to 4 times the past decade high and offshore leasing to 20 sales per year could raise up to $350 billion over 10 years. Those are just the effects for the federal government and don't include the very significant benefits to state and local governments. These estimates are in line with CBO's estimating principles and don't rely on dynamic effects, although dynamic modeling would show likely more significant benefits. Additionally, the Trump administration has undertaken significant actions that should increase the value of federal leases, but are not fully captured in these modeling results. This could mean even greater benefits. Some of the administration's early actions relate to energy specifically, others are broader. But all should increase the value of onshore and offshore federal oil and gas leases, resulting bonus payments, and direct fiscal effects. Beyond writing key provisions into statute, Congress has an opportunity to lock in savings through proposals such as the REINS Act, which would provide congressional review of regulatory actions with significant negative effects, preventing future administrations from rolling back the fiscally positive actions of this one. The REINS Act could easily provide hundreds of billions to over $1 trillion of direct fiscal savings based on my estimates. The Foundation for Government Accountability found REINS could have saved taxpayers at least $844 billion if in place during the last administration. And as a final note, I encourage this committee to review mining and resource use regulations more broadly. The more critical a resource, for instance, potash for agriculture or rare earth minerals for electronics, the more important it is to identify regulatory and statutory barriers to domestic production, to eliminate those barriers through legislation. Thank you. I welcome your questions and discussion.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes Mr. Swedenham for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Chairman Westerman, Chairman Collins, Ranking Member Dexter, and distinguished members of the committee. I'm honored to be able to participate in this hearing today. I have prepared some slides, and I'm hoping each of you have a copy in front of you. The U.S. oil and gas industry is the most dynamic, price-responsive, efficient, and technically capable in the world. Although this has been true for many decades, probably since the start of the oil industry, modern oil industry in the 18th century, the superiority was clearly demonstrated in the last 15 years. If you look at slide 2, you can show this. We show the level of oil production from the U.S. and from the rest of the world relative to its level in 2010. During this period, global oil production, including condensates and natural gas liquids, increased 13 million barrels a day. U.S. oil production increased as shown in blue. The rest of the world increases are shown in orange. We display the data this way so that it's very clear to see the U.S. contribution to the increase in world oil production, and the U.S. industry accounted for 90% of that 13 million barrels since 2010. Over this, we can also see that in 2020 and 2023, the rest of the world's oil production actually went negative relative to 2010. I'll return a little later to this issue of curtailing production. Slide 3 shows the story for natural gas, and it's basically the same. The U.S. accounted for just over 50% of the world's increase in natural gas productions from 2010 to 2023, and this meant an increase by 2023. America was producing a quarter of the world's natural gas. The U.S. industry is able to outperform the rest of the world for a variety of reasons, but an important aspect is the competitiveness. It is intense competition that forces U.S. companies to continually become more productive. Slide 4 shows this phenomenon of increased development and efficiency in the gas industry over the last 16 years. In 2008, U.S. gas producing was less than 60 billion cubic feet a day, and we had almost 1,600 rigs running. Since then, rig rates have continued to decline, and employment, as the ranking member mentioned, has declined, and yet U.S. gas production has increased from under 60 to almost 100 billion cubic feet a day, and we're running rigs at only 100 rigs per day and sustaining that growth in production. In order to estimate the benefits of increased oil and gas leasing in prospective federal lands, two of my colleagues at EPRINC, Max Pizer and Matthew Saworski, undertook a comprehensive analysis of prospective federal lands in 4 regions. Slide 5 shows the results of that analysis in terms of incremental oil and gas production. The analysis is based on representative oil and gas projects in each of 4 regions: the OCS in the Gulf of America, the Naval Petroleum Reserve in Alaska, the lower 48s, and Arctic National Wildlife Reserve. Slide 6 shows the results of the analysis in terms of incremental revenues from bonus bids, royalties, corporate taxes, and individual taxes. And even though oil and gas production doesn't peak until 2039 from these projects, the slide summarizes federal revenues only during the first 10 years. And using that approach, we estimate incremental revenues of $122 billion, incremental federal revenues. Now, that's a single point estimate, and it's really important to recognize the range of uncertainty in estimating future oil and gas production. Slide 7 summarizes a landmark study by Richard Nearing. Now, the increased production is important, but actually what's most important is the flexibility and the responsiveness of the U.S. industry. And in the following slides, I show how as we increase the responsiveness, of what economists call the price elasticity of supply, we actually reduce the profitability of OPEC to make more money by cutting production. They're currently cutting production 6 million barrels a day, which has an effect of raising oil prices about $10 a barrel. If we make the U.S. industry more elastic, more responsive to price changes, we can cut that incentive to restrict production, and OPEC will have less power. I'm happy to answer questions. Look forward to the discussion.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes Ms. Gibson for 5 minutes.
Chairman Collins, Chairman Westerman, Ranking Member Dexter, and distinguished members of the subcommittee and committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify here today. My name is Megan Gibson. I serve as a senior attorney at the Southern Environmental Law Center. We're a nonprofit rooted in the South, committed to ensuring clean air, clean water, and a livable climate for all. If we are serious about ushering in a new era of American energy dominance, one that benefits every American household and business, we must not look backward to fossil fuels, but forward to technologies of the future. And the future is renewable. Renewables are no longer a distant ideal. They are the engine of American energy growth. In 2024, over 90% of new utility scale capacity came from renewables: solar, wind, battery storage. These technologies are now the cheapest, fastest to deploy sources of power. They're creating jobs, they're lowering bills, and delivering resilience in the face of extreme weather. In Texas, long seen as a fossil fuel stronghold, renewables are transforming the grid, making it more reliable, more resilient. During last summer's record-breaking heat wave, solar and storage supplied over 25,000 megawatts in Texas, keeping the lights on for millions. In North Carolina, after Hurricane Helene knocked out the grid, solar microgrids powered entire communities when nothing else could. These are not hypotheticals. These are real life-saving results right here, right now. Clean energy isn't just reliable and resilient, it's also an economic powerhouse. In 2023 alone, 149,000 new clean energy jobs were added nationwide. These are good-paying, accessible jobs. Most don't require a four-year degree, and they're lifting up communities across the country, especially in rural areas. In North Carolina, solar has increased property tax revenue without burdening local infrastructure. In Texas, renewables and storage are expected to deliver nearly $50 billion, that's with a B, $billion in lifetime payments to local governments and landowners. At the same time, fossil fuels are faltering under their own weight. Today, 99% of coal plants cost more to run than it would cost to build a new wind or solar facility nearby. In the Southeast, uneconomic coal generation alone costs customers $5.3 billion. And natural gas, at best, it's a gamble. Price spikes like those we saw in 2022 hit families and businesses hard. One utility in the Carolinas saw its fuel costs jump by nearly $1 billion, and those costs get passed on to people. True energy dominance is about reliability, affordability, and security for Americans, not what more fossil fuel reliance will bring us. Fuel price shocks, stranded assets, blackout risks. It's about modernizing the grid so clean power flows freely, efficiently across regions and within them. But right now, our outdated, fragmented transmission system is holding us back. We need to triple or quadruple our transmission capacity to meet rising demand, unlock clean energy's full potential. Fortunately, smart programs like the Department of Energy's SITAP program, an initiative that streamlines federal transmission permitting, could help us do just that. But we need more strong federal coordination, support, and the use of existing tools like the National Interest Electric Transmission Corridor designations, or full use of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission's backstop siting authority to help get us there. Let me be clear, leading the world in energy isn't about drilling more wells or building more pipelines. It's about developing and owning the technologies that will define the 21st century. China is racing ahead in clean energy production. If we slow down now, we risk ceding American leadership in the very industries that will power the global economy. We are at a crossroads. We can cling to the fossil-fueled past and call it dominance, or we can invest in the clean, modern, resilient energy system our future demands. This is our moment to lead. Not more of the same, polluting uneconomic systems, but in wind, solar, batteries, high-voltage transmission lines that will serve as the backbone of a resilient, modern grid and American innovation. Let's build an America where no family is left in the dark during a storm, where no family has to live next to a facility that spews pollution or send their children to school where they go outside and struggle to breathe. Instead, let's continue to build an America where electricity is cheap, clean, homegrown, where we are not only energy independent, but clean energy dominant. Thank you. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes Dr. Daratna for 5 minutes.
Chair Collins, Ranking Member Dexter, members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify about energy policy. My name is Kevin Daratna. I'm the Acting Director, Chief Statistician, and the Senior Research Fellow at the Heritage Foundation's Center for Data Analysis. The views I express in this testimony are my own and should not be construed as representing any official position of the Heritage Foundation. Access to affordable and reliable energy is not just a convenience, it's the foundation of a thriving society. From brewing a morning cup of coffee, to powering life-saving hospital equipment, to conducting this very hearing, energy is woven into every aspect of modern life. And throughout history, every major leap in human progress, from the steam engine to the smartphone, has been powered by greater access to energy. At the Heritage Foundation, my colleagues and I have explored energy access in great detail. Our research has overwhelmingly shown that countries with high energy access consistently outperform others on virtually every metric of human well-being. Between 1900 and 2018, global energy consumption rose dramatically, and so did global life expectancy, which more than doubled from 32 years to over 72. At the same time, real per capita income rose by well over 500% both domestically and worldwide. In fact, no country achieves high income without also consuming large amounts of energy. It's a near universal pattern. More energy, more prosperity. And access to energy doesn't just improve economic output, it saves lives. Countries that consume more than 30,000 kilowatt hours per capita have lower child and maternal mortality and higher life expectancy. In contrast, countries such as Malawi or Sierra Leone, with severely limited energy access, face crushing public health challenges. Clean water, modern sanitation, and life-saving medical technologies, all powered by energy, have slashed mortality rates. Denying this access is not just a policy failure, it's a moral one as well. Energy-driven innovation has also transformed agriculture. For example, from 1961 to 2018, agricultural output has soared by over 70% both domestically and worldwide, as brilliantly designed machines took on much of the heavy labor. To put it succinctly, affordable, reliable energy is the engine of human progress. So now let's take a closer look at energy policy. Two facts become clear. The first fact is that ill-conceived energy policy retards progress. Under the Biden administration, a range of mistaken regulations had been aimed at phasing out carbon-based energy. These included halting new oil and gas leases on federal lands and pushing zero-emission vehicles mandates, among others. At the Heritage Foundation's Center for Data Analysis, we evaluated these measures using the Heritage Energy Model, a clone of the Energy Information Agency's National Energy Modeling System. The findings of these ill-conceived measures over an 18-year time horizon were stark. An average employment shortfall of over 1.2 million jobs, income losses for a typical family of four exceeding $5,000 per year, and a total GDP loss exceeding $7 trillion. And yet, what do these costly measures achieve in terms of climate benefit? We ran climate projections using the Model for the Assessment of Greenhouse Gas-Induced Climate Change, an IPCC model. Even assuming the US completely eliminated fossil fuels, a highly unrealistic scenario, the temperature mitigation by 2100 would be less than 0.23 degrees Celsius. There's no way around it. Enormous economic sacrifice, negligible environmental return. Now let's turn to our second fact. Clear-headed energy promotes progress. America is rich in energy resources. The Institute for Energy Research has noted that the United States has over 1.6 trillion barrels of oil and over 4 quadrillion cubic feet of natural gas below our very feet. At current consumption rates, that's over 200 years of oil and 130 years of natural gas. At the Heritage Foundation Center for Data Analysis, we simulated a high oil and gas scenario using assumptions identical to the EIA's. The results were quite striking. Namely, over a 25-year time horizon, the results show an average employment gain of 5.3 million jobs annually, a $12,000 annual income increase for a family of 4, and a $25 trillion boost to GDP. And the climate impact? Practically zero. Even under extreme assumptions, our climate simulations show that this would raise global temperatures by no more than a measly 0.03 degrees Celsius by 2100. So the path forward is clear. Ill-conceived policies that restrict energy access and pose real harm while offering virtually no environmental benefit. But policies that promote energy abundance through innovation and regulatory reform can deliver massive gains for economic growth, public health, and long-term prosperity. So it's no exaggeration to say expanding energy access isn't merely smart policy, it's a moral imperative. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.
I thank the witnesses for their testimony. The chair will now recognize members for 5 minutes each for questions. Okay, and the chair recognizes himself for 5 minutes. My first question is for Ms. Gibson. Ms. Gibson, our ranking member cited traditional energy subsidies of $15 billion annually. Given your expertise in alternative energy, how much in subsidies was provided under the Inflation Reduction Act?
Thank you for your question. Thank you. Thank you, sir. Thank you for your question. I don't know the exact number offhand.
Okay, well, let me see if I can help a little bit. According to the University of Pennsylvania Wharton School, the CBO dramatically underestimated the $391 billion in energy and climate provisions, and that the true estimate is actually $1 trillion over a 10-year period. The Cato Institute placed the number actually much higher, at between $2 trillion and $4.67 trillion, and that is over 100 times the cited subsidy that was mentioned in the opening remarks for an industry sector that makes up less than 10% of domestic energy production. The truth is that the subsidy that appears to be required for so-called renewable energy to be competitive as an economic energy source only masks the true cost of that energy and dramatically increases the debt our nation passes on to the next generation. My next question is for Mr. Swedenham. Your analysis makes a critical point about energy transitions. They take time, and they tend to be additive, not subtractive. That aligns with what Alaskans know, my home state. Wind and solar can complement but not replace baseload power in a state with 30 below zero winters and thousands of miles between grid connections. So let me ask you, given what we've seen with recent grid instability and surging demand, how dangerous is it economically and strategically to overestimate the speed of the renewable transition, particularly when it leads to sidelining proven resources like Alaskan oil and gas?
Thank you for the question. It is true that the grid has become less reliable as we increase our dependence on renewable energy. It also makes the energy more expensive, and we see that all around the world. Because the wind and solar are weather dependent, they're intermittent, and so they can produce when the sun's shining and the wind's blowing. But there are periods, and sometimes they're long periods, when the wind is not blowing. And of course, every night you have to worry about not having solar, but even cloudy days, you don't have the peak capacity. So what happens is that if you want the grid to be reliable, you have to have dispatchable capacity equal to your peak load. And so that means that you need to have gas or coal or nuclear, something that you can turn on and off. It's not weather dependent. And when you have to have that capacity, but then you bring in the renewables and you run the renewables, the load factor, the capacity factor of those other facilities goes down. And that's what makes the electricity more expensive. And we've seen it all around the world, in the US and Europe, state by state, in Asia where I'm working. You can see as you increase the renewables, the price to the customer goes up. And that's because you have to have two energy systems. And that's just more expensive. The issue of so I'll leave it there. Thank you.
We've noticed, follow-up question, we've noticed in Alaska, in areas where there are microgrids deployed, the attempt to utilize renewable energy sources as an adjunct to traditional diesel fuel generation has led to actual increases in the consumption of diesel fuel. Can you comment on perhaps why that may be the case?
No, I think I'd have to know the specifics. You're saying increases, what if they're replacing? I don't think that should cause an increase. So I'm sorry, I need to know the specifics.
Yeah, and I'll provide you with some additional specifics. So,
thank you.
Yeah, so what we've observed is that, that in order to continue to restart that diesel generation capacity, it actually increases the amount of diesel consumption because of the intermittent nature of the so-called renewable sources of energy.
Yes. You've raised a very important point, which is that because the renewable sources like wind and solar are direct current, they have to go through an inverter to create the alternating current that our electric grids run on. And they don't have the physical inertia associated with the rotating machinery, the generators. And in fact, they follow the generators. And what happens is, if there is a reduction in renewable energy, you can have a shortage and then a trip off and a blackout. In Australia in 2016, they had a black start problem where they didn't have enough rotating machinery. So the inertia associated with the rotating machinery is very important to the stability of the grid.
Thank you for clarifying that. Now I'd recognize our ranking member, Dr. Dexter, for any questions for the witnesses.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Gibson, you have read the testimony from other witnesses and heard some of it today. Do those economic estimates of impacts from digging up even more oil and gas from public lands seem realistic to you? And why or why not?
Thank you, Dr. Dexter, for the question. No, they do not. And I'll just say quite simply that we've seen this movie before, and that in 2017 and 2018, there were pretty exaggerated cost estimates as to what could be gleaned from the auctioning of leases in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge in the billions. And what resulted from that auction was less than 1% of what was originally put on the table.
Thank you. And what evidence do we have that renewables lead to lower energy prices for consumers? It's been refuted here this morning. I just want to hear from you on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, every year, there's increasingly mounting empirical evidence that renewables are our economic future. They're driving economic growth. In the top 12 states in which renewables have penetrated the grid more than anywhere else, 10 of those states, prices are less for consumers. People don't have to pay as much on their energy bills. The proof's in the pudding.
Okay. And if we meet our energy needs with renewable energy, how will that impact our economy?
Overall, positively. I mean, the economic benefits are tremendous in terms of consumer savings, industry, development, jobs, manufacturing, sales, as well as we will lead the world in energy innovation and get ahead of our competitors such as in China.
And I'm just going to add to that as someone who does care for folks who are impacted by toxic fumes and other smoke exposures, that we know that the exposure to those substances in the air absolutely impact our health, and the dramatic impacts of adverse health outcomes need to be factored into these economic modelings. I think that we'll move on to public health now. We pursue at this point, or we're discussing whether we pursue a transition to clean renewable energy. And Ms. Gibson, can you speak to how continuing to prop up the oil and gas industry in the name of energy dominance could increase public health risks and affect the well-being of communities across the country?
Well, I would say, Dr. Dexter, you probably know more than most, but dramatically it increases the likelihood of premature death, of cardiovascular disease, of respiratory illnesses. And I would invite anybody, including esteemed members of this committee, to come take a trip of Cameron Parish, Louisiana, and talk to the multi-generational fishermen that live there, who we represent, whose families have been impacted by the LNG facilities that they're building on top of their communities, and the impacts it has had on their family, the very real health impacts that it's had on these people's families and lives.
I also want to ask whether you believe that NEPA is the barrier to expanding clean energy infrastructure and development.
No, NEPA is not the barrier. NEPA is not a permitting statute. I know it's often the scapegoat in a lot of conversations with NEPA. In fact, if used correctly, can increase efficiency of the build out of infrastructure.
Excellent, thank you. And in our last few minutes, Ms. Gibson, can you please briefly describe the work the Southern Environmental Law Center does on the ground for communities impacted by natural disasters?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say that the most recent example that comes to mind, unfortunately, is what happened in Western North Carolina when we were hit by Hurricane Helene. Our organization worked directly with communities on the ground. Solar, I should add, was absolutely integral to supporting those communities and providing power when gas and fossil went offline after the hurricane hit. And our own staff members are members of these communities that lived through this horrible, horrific, extreme weather event. And right now there's fires burning in North Carolina, South Carolina, New Jersey, and we're of course seeing an increased rise of weather events across the country, and we need to address these issues, and we need to address them now.
Great, thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes the committee chairman, Mr. Westerman, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and again, thank you to the witnesses for your testimony. Ms. Gibson, do you support nuclear power? And does your organization support building more nuclear power?
We believe in safe, reliable energy.
Does that include nuclear power?
With increased research and more efficiency, there's a possibility in the future.
So right now, it doesn't include nuclear power. Mr. Swedenham, the data shows that oil, gas, and coal produce 84% of the energy in the United States right now. And without getting into a lot of detail, we know that solar panels take up 4,000 to 10,000 acres of land per gigawatt, whereas you build a nuclear power plant, it's much, much less land than that, and the energy density on oil and gas and coal is much greater. But do you see any foreseeable way in even the next 100 years to not have any fossil fuel component to our energy supply?
Well, you'd have to have dispatchable power if you want to have an electrical grid. And so relying solely on interruptible power, you would need to have some way to store the electricity. And so batteries are efficient and economic for storing about 4 hours of electricity, but when you get into long-term storage and seasonal storage, it's very uneconomic. So to me, it's possible to have a completely renewable system, but it's only been done in areas that are very small and very specific. You really need to have the dispatchable energy or very large electricity storage, which is difficult.
Which would more than likely include nuclear power and advancing more
Yes,
hydraulic,
yes. So the nuclear power,
hydroelectricity.
excuse me.
And as we look at oil and gas production, we saw a kind of a peak in conventional oil production in the 70s, and then fracking came along, and we saw an uptick again. I believe it was this week I saw an article in the the Wall Street Journal that suggested the Permian may be peaking on oil production using fracking, but we also know there's a new technology out there called CO2, enhanced oil recovery. And I believe some of the projections show we could get another 10% of the oil out of conventional wells and fracked wells using CO2. Can you comment on how important new technologies, and Mr. Jensen, you may want to comment on this too, are to being able to get more energy production, and what our focus should be on these new technologies?
Yeah, the new technology is extremely important, and you're absolutely right that we were concerned that the U.S. was running out of oil and gas, and now, as a result of the fracking technology, we are the largest oil and gas producers in the world. In addition to the new technology allowing more recovery of resources, it also expands the competitiveness of the industry. In the 1980s, with a higher computing capacity, as computers became stronger, small companies with just 2 or 3 people could compete against the majors, who up till then were the only ones who could do the seismic processing that was required. So the new technology not only allows you to recover more resource, but it also makes the industry more competitive.
Mr. Jensen?
I'd add to that, as we expand the production and we expand leasing, it'll give new opportunities to develop new technologies. And so through a combination of executive orders that are limiting the barriers to energy production, and then legislation that might expand production farther, these things will work synergistically and with new technology, and they'll all work together to increase energy output more rapidly.
So we hear the argument that oil is a global commodity. If we produce more, it could drive the prices down, maybe get to a point where we couldn't afford to invest in producing more oil. But oil is easily traded across the globe. But can you explain how gas is different from that? How there's such a huge demand for gas, but the transportation restrictions on gas are really hindering our ability to produce and sell more gas?
Yes, so the gas is, transportation is a much larger component of the cost of distributing gas than of oil. So you're absolutely right. Oil is very much an international commodity because the transportation cost relative to the value of the commodity is so low. Natural gas, it's different. Natural gas may sell for $2 or $3 an MCF, but you need to spend an additional $5 to refrigerate it, ship it across an ocean, and then regasify it. So that's why the international gas market is growing more slowly. But it is continuing to grow, and we do fully expect that gas trade will continue to expand, especially in countries who need more electricity, need more dispatchable power, want the clean energy of natural gas, and so they'll be using more and more natural gas. This is especially true in Asia.
And we have over 4 quadrillion cubic feet of natural gas, which is pretty mind-boggling. Yield back.
The chair now recognizes Mr. Hernandez for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member. So I understand the fossil fuel industry is one of the major drivers behind the climate crisis, and that climate change in turn is intensifying natural disasters by increasing the frequency and the severity of extreme weather events. Ms. Gibson, can you speak to the role that renewables can play in bolstering community energy resilience and supporting critical local infrastructure after such disasters?
Absolutely. Renewables are more resilient, more reliable than fossils. During Winter Storm Uri and Winter Storm Elliott especially, wind produced 4 times the amount of energy than was originally anticipated. And meanwhile, fossils were completely offline, and they were providing much needed power to people in desperate times.
And, I come from Puerto Rico, and we have some of the highest electricity rates in the country, partly because we rely on imported fossil fuels for energy. How could expanding renewable energy in disaster-prone areas reduce dependence on fragile fuel supply chains that can be disrupted by storms, wildfires, or other disasters?
It would increase reliability, resilience, and quite frankly, safety and security of the communities and people.
And would you say that, utility-scale solar and battery installations are easier to scale up rapidly in response to energy crises than fossil fuel infrastructure?
It's not me that would say that, it's the evidence and the empirical data, the writings on the wall. It's faster to deploy and it's cheaper.
Right now, Puerto Rico faces a shortage of close to 800 megawatts. It's expected in the summer. And, I'll be very transparent. I'll take whatever I can find in terms of energy sources to prevent power outages in the summer. Even if tomorrow we discovered the dirtiest source of energy in the history of the world. Obviously, it doesn't have to be that way. If we had to find a temporary solution to that generation problem, could renewables be an alternative, given the ease of scaling them up quickly?
Absolutely.
Could you provide maybe more concrete examples as to how you could address a 700, 800 megawatt shortage using renewables in a very short time frame?
Well, Representative, I'm not an engineer, but I'm sure that there are people smarter than me that could provide that answer to you. But I will say that, again, it's faster and cheaper, period. That's
Okay.
what the evidence shows.
Okay. Mr. Swedenham, I think you were nodding in disagreement. I would love to hear your opinion.
Well, you do. My recommendation would be to get a gas turbine on a barge. In other words, people who need power rapidly on the order of 800 megawatts. And you could, if you bring a gas turbine on a barge and use that, you can hook right into the grid, and that would be done. You'd use a floating regasification floating vessel, which is also easily leased. Puerto Rico, I think it's very interesting you mentioned that, because the island communities are tougher for energy, and it does make energy more expensive. The island of Kauai, if I might, committed to going to renewable energy, and so they've gotten very close with lots of solar, but it's a very small system, and it's taken up a lot of land for a small population in Kauai, but that would be an example to look at. But they did need to find a way to guarantee reliability, and so they took their existing coal plant, shut off the coal burner, and replaced it with a biogen generator, but they haven't got that up and running yet, so they're still using diesel. But that would be a way you could get dispatchable source with solar and storage. But it's a big project, and so if you want to get 800 megawatts this summer, you just need to find a barge with a generator on it and fuel it with LNG.
No, and I appreciate that. That is very helpful. That is something that we have heard and that I believe the administration is considering. And like I said, I'm more interested in solving the problem right now than necessarily in the issue of energy. Now, I have heard that the supply chains for natural gas turbines are also very backed up, and it may take years to get the necessary equipment. Do you have something to say about these challenges?
It is true that there's a backlog for new turbines for a permanent installation, and a lot of those are being purchased for artificial intelligence funding, but there are companies that rent them. So if you need 800 megawatts this summer, that's what you're not going to be purchasing a permanent installation for that.
Right. I appreciate your responses, and thank you both. I yield back.
The chair now recognizes Mr. Stauber for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, and I want to thank to our witnesses for being here. I'm going to change gears just a little bit. Here in the United States, we responsibly and ethically produce our abundant energy and natural resources better than anywhere else in the world. And when we do, we're able to bolster our economy, create good-paying union jobs, and raise much-needed revenue for the federal, state, county, and local governments. We have a decision before us today. We can either develop our own energy and minerals resources here, enjoying all of the economic benefits that come with it, or rely on foreign adversarial nations like China or Russia. I'm glad that under the Trump administration and congressional Republicans, it's clear which path we'll take over the next 4 years. While this morning's hearing has focused primarily on economic impact of developing Americans' abundant energy resources, I want to focus on the incredible prospect we have to develop our nation's critical and other non-fuel minerals, including the tremendous mineral wealth we have in the Duluth complex and elsewhere across northern Minnesota. According to the U.S. Geological Survey's latest data published earlier this year, the development, processing, refining, and recycling of non-fuel minerals in the United States contributes nearly $29 billion to our nation's GDP annually. That's even while this nation is stuck currently with the Biden-era policies that have locked up a vast majority of our nation's critical minerals, like those in the Duluth complex in northeastern Minnesota. It's policies like the Biden administration's mining ban in the Superior National Forest in northern Minnesota, which locked up over 225,000 acres from responsible mineral development. And as my colleagues all know well by now, this jeopardized development of the Duluth complex, where there are trillions and trillions of dollars of mineral wealth. If we are able to develop our tremendous mineral wealth in Minnesota, Arizona, Alaska, Colorado, Idaho, Nevada, Michigan, Wyoming, Montana, and everywhere in between, that $29 billion annually added to our nation's GDP will skyrocket. I want to point out a figure that when we talk about mining from the raw material, the gross domestic product, to our economy, I just mentioned $29 billion. That's just the original estimate on the GDP. It doesn't go downstream, which is hundreds of billions of dollars that we can add to our GDP annually if we're allowed to mine those critical minerals here. We have to mine them, process them here, and then we can manufacture here. Mr. Swedenham, while your testimony and research has focused primarily on oil and gas development, including the impact that domestic production of oil and gas can have on OPEC's ability to control oil and gas prices, I believe the same arguments can be made for global mineral commodities. Would you agree that just like the oil and gas development, domestic critical mineral development would weaken China and other adversarial nations' control over global mineral prices and their ability to artificially manipulate mineral commodity prices?
So the concentration of these strategic minerals, especially those needed for wind turbines and solar panels and batteries, China dominates not only the extraction and processing, but also the refining of those materials to an extraordinary degree. So where OPEC Plus has a market share of about 35%, for many of these minerals, China has a market share of 80%. And they've been happy or willing to use that dominance when they want to put economic leverage on other countries. So I absolutely agree that the concentration of those minerals and processing in China is a security risk, and it would be helpful to address it with U.S. production.
I really appreciate, with my 20 seconds left, I really appreciate that comment. We can mine here, we can process here, we can manufacture. We do it better, in my opinion, better than anybody else in the world. And when we know better, we should do better. We cannot allow adversarial nations to control our destiny. As the Undersecretary of Defense and Undersecretary of Defense said when I asked, what would it be like if China stopped selling us our critical minerals? And it'd be devastating and dangerous. Department of Defense and Energy Undersecretary said that to me. It would be devastating and dangerous. When we know better, we do better. We do it better here in the United States of America than anywhere in the country. I yield back.
Chair now recognizes myself for 5 minutes for questioning. Ms. Swedenham, I just want to pick up right where Mr. Stauber left off. Not to mention the fact that China uses child labor to mine these critical rare earth minerals. But let's look at China. China processes nearly 90% of the global rare earth. I think you were alluding to that a few minutes ago. 60% of production and 83% of processing, and China is the primary import source for 50 critical minerals here in the U.S., the primary processing source. So given that China's dominance in the extraction, process, and refining of these critical minerals that are essential to the manufacture of wind and solar equipment, what are those energy risks that Mr. Stauber was talking about that created by accelerating our reliance on this renewable energy?
So it's truly economic risk because China, with such a large position in these minerals, can decide what price they'll sell them at, and they can cut off customers. So if in the U.S. we have manufacturers who are depending on those materials, they can easily be cut off or the price can be raised. And because they have so much more market power than OPEC did, similar to the effects of the Arab oil embargo and the Iranian oil crisis when we saw prices skyrocket, cutting off those materials would also have that effect. I think if I may, I'd also like to point about, we hear very much about how the renewable energy is clean, the wind and solar, but in fact what you're doing is you're not eliminating emissions, you're exporting emissions, because the mining and processing and manufacturing of those strategic critical minerals for the renewable technologies are being produced with coal energy in China. So the emissions, as you'll see, the emissions of the world are continuing to go up. So even though it's correct that we've seen a lot more installation of renewable energy, CO2 emissions are not going down. And the reason they're not going down is that the developed countries are exporting their emissions to the developing world in China. And that deindustrialization that we're observing in Germany, the deindustrialization is also happening in Japan because of high energy costs. And so hopefully we'll not do the same thing in the United States.
You're right. As a matter of fact, China's opening up numerous coal plants every week. So we are just exporting emissions. And the fact that China has made no bones about it, they want to be dominant by 2045 in every category from economic to military. And so we need to, we've got to get our processing and our own refining and our mining back to America. Mr. Jensen, I want to thank you for testifying today. I want to talk to you about the energy costs for Georgia families. In your written testimony, you talk about the price reductions and say that Georgia household of 3 in 2025 with a 10% price decline will save $763. With a 50% reduction, Georgia families could save $3,800. Can you tell me what is needed for Georgia families to be able to save this money?
Yes, thank you for the question, and I will tell you, but first I'll note that those numbers you just cited, that's only the direct costs. And so when you take into account the indirect costs associated with energy prices, those numbers could be 2 to 3 times as high savings for Georgia families. And for that to happen, there needs to be an all-of-the-above energy strategy in the United States to increase every stage of energy production. And we've seen this administration start to implement that strategy through executive order. But if we want that to be as successful as possible and to be lasting, then the way to do it is through legislation as well.
Well, expand on it. Why is the cost of energy so high that families could save anywhere from $700 to $3,800 depending on that price reduction?
We've seen for this previous administration a severe constraint on the types of energy sources that are most widely used: natural gas, oil, and we've seen those constrained for the last 4 years, driving up prices. And so now if we, and we've also seen other kinds of energy like nuclear constrained. And so if we start to unconstrain America's potential to produce these resources, then we can snap up and start to see a dramatic increase in production. The United States, I've been poking around these data recently, we're huge in these energy markets, and so we actually govern the global price of energy, and if we produce more, we can influence the price of energy both in the United States and at a global level.
Thank you. I see my time has expired. I tell you what, I think we're going to go with the second round of questioning, and the chair now recognizes Mr. Westerman for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, thank you to the witnesses. Mr. Daratna, can you explain how the Congressional Budget Office scores energy projects and how you would do that differently?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. My understanding is that the Congressional Budget Office will take legislation that is given to them and score it in a static manner. What I would recommend doing is incorporating a dynamic macroeconomic feedback, incorporating the larger manifestations of the increased supply of the various sources of energy that are being altered by the proposed policy.
Thank you. And so I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about the importance of permitting reform to be able to not only produce energy, but also to do mining. I know a couple of these gentlemen to my right have vast mining deposits in their states, and America is blessed with a lot of minerals and elements, except we don't get them out of the ground. And if you look at the report from USGS on critical minerals, we're 100% dependent on imports on a lot of these minerals and elements, even though we have them right here in the U.S. And recently I've had companies come to me and say they've got deposits of like graphite, which we're 100% dependent on graphite. If you look at who's the dominant world supplier of graphite, it's China. So why wouldn't we develop our graphite? And the feedback is because there's a concern that China will dump graphite on the global market, drive down the price, and make it uneconomical to have a project here in the U.S. So if we could get past all the hurdles to permitting on some of these mines, then you got the economic problems of dumping by foreign countries. And these are things that are not only critical to our national security, but also critical to energy, because when you're talking about energy anymore, and especially electric energy, you're talking about mining and minerals and elements. So, Mr. Jensen, I'll start with you. Can you comment on the importance for permitting reform, for developing more mining materials, and how to combat dumping by our adversaries to keep production out of the United States?
It's a combination here where if you combine the tariff approach that this administration is taking for national security reasons, and you combine that with permitting reform to speed up the permitting, with smart deregulation to make it so that there are not too many barriers to getting these things out of the ground, then it'll solve that issue, where it will at once allow for us to increase the domestic production here, and at the same time, it'll put up barriers for our trading partners who have their own barriers against us, and it can create this reciprocity in the way that we treat our trading partners. And so I think the key here is to combine the strategies where you have tariffs and you have deregulation and you have permitting reform, and you put the three together, and then we can see this all of these resources that are on the ground here start to be dug up and produced and refined and then used in the markets.
And Mr. Swedenham, could you elaborate on that as well, and maybe talk about, the tariffs are a way to incentivize more production here, but it's still going to take time to get these mines up and permitted up and operating. I know Mr. Whitman, who's on this committee, has a bill called the Secure Act that would create a national repository for critical minerals and elements that could maybe help in that area in the interim while we get the mining up? And also, can you comment on how important that is to the overall energy picture?
So the permitting's extremely important for the mining and also for the gas industry. So with the mining, the permitting's very important, and I agree with what Mr. Jensen just said about the importance of permitting on mines. Even when you do get the permitting, it's my understanding that you're still talking about 10 to 15 years to open new mines. So doing something in the interim, perhaps a strategic reserve, is a very sensible thing to do with respect to those strategic minerals. With the other area where permitting is very important is in natural gas transportation. And we've seen in the past where the inability to permit pipelines has situations where we have enormous reserves of natural gas in the Marcellus in Pennsylvania, and yet in Massachusetts they're still importing LNG at a much higher cost simply because we can't get permits to build pipelines from Pennsylvania to Massachusetts. So I think the permitting reform's extremely important, and also with the increased electricity generation, increasing electricity load associated with artificial intelligence, data centers, and electric vehicles. On all of those, you're going to want to be able to have the permitting reform that allows natural gas to get to where those generators are, in addition to the renewable transmission lines.
Thank you. I know talking about CO2 enhanced oil recovery earlier, some of the stuff I've been reading and getting information on said we could use all of the CO2 produced in the United States in recovery, which would be sequestering the CO2, but you obviously can't do that without an elaborate pipeline network, which
yes.
You've got to have permitting to be able to do that.
Yes, and in fact, the CO2 molecule is much larger, so the pipelines need to be even larger. The CO2 technology is not new. They've been doing it in the industry for decades. And so you just have to have the right reservoir to be able to enhance the oil recovery with CO2. Right now, we use naturally produced CO2 from the ground, but if you capture the CO2 from an industrial plant or a generator, then you can use that to enhance the oil recovery. They're doing that in Abu Dhabi right now, and we're actually doing that also in Texas.
Thank you. I went way over time, Mr. Chairman.
That's all right. You're the chairman. The chair now recognizes Mr. Begich for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My first question here is to Dr. Daratna. You did a fantastic job providing some high-quality information. I know that some of the conversation that we've had so far this morning has focused on health outcomes. And health outcomes are important. Public health is important. If we're polluting the environment, we need to understand that. What is fascinating about the data that you provided is global per capita energy consumption and its relationship to 4 key health metrics. One of those metrics being the number of doctors per 1,000 people, another being life expectancy in years, another child mortality rate, and another maternal mortality deaths per 100,000 live births. What we see in your data very clearly is an extraordinarily strong relationship between energy production and positive health outcomes. And we hear from folks on the other side of this issue often that producing energy creates negative health outcomes, but the hard data says the exact opposite. Can you provide us with some additional context to your research on these matters?
Oh, absolutely, and that's a great question, Congressman. So, as I was alluding to when I began my testimony, many people take energy for granted. Like when you flip on a light switch or turn on your car, many people don't understand the beauty that goes on behind the scenes. This is exactly the case in terms of healthcare. For example, energy is needed to enable doctors to do their jobs, to train doctors. So this is why you see more doctors in areas that consume more energy. In terms of life expectancy and child mortality and maternal mortality, life expectancy increases, child and maternal mortality plummet because in countries that consume more energy, they have more access to this life-saving medical equipment and they have the ability to power them. But this is, to me, actually one of the most interesting parts of that analysis. And the paper that that's coming from is titled Powering Human Advancements with my colleagues Diana Furchtgott-Roth, Richard Stern, and Miles Pollard, and it's published on the Heritage Foundation website. If you look at deaths due to dirty air and deaths due to dirty water, they plummet in countries that consume more energy by over 90% compared to the less developed counterparts on the other side of the world. And the bottom line is affordable and reliable energy is paramount to being able to have clean air, to being able to filter water and engage in modern sanitation techniques. So the bottom line is access to affordable and reliable energy is paramount to a flourishing society.
Thank you for that additional context. I couldn't agree more. You know, we have a moral imperative in this Congress to ensure that we have inexpensive, abundant, reliable energy, no matter where that source is coming from, because the data, the hard data shows that that is what is in the best interest of the public health. And I appreciate that research that you've done, the hard work that you've put in. One additional question for Mr. Swedenham. Expanding our strategic reserve for critical minerals, we have an opportunity, I believe, in this Congress to take a look at the critical minerals that we have that we hold in reserve and the critical minerals that we do not currently hold in reserve. Can you give us some additional context or maybe just some of your own thoughts on why we should have strategic mineral and energy reserves and why they're important to our national security and economic interests?
I think the one way I think about it is an example of when Japan was trying to protect its fishing areas from the Chinese, and the Chinese kept encroaching, and so the Japanese Coast Guard captured a Chinese fishing vessel. The Chinese immediately shut off the supply of iridium to Japan, which is the blue in CRT in computer displays. The Japanese caved within a week and gave the fishing vessel back. So that ability to have so much control over critical materials and ability to cut them off, I think provides an economic risk to us that we don't want to live with.
Thank you for that insight. You know, Alaska has nearly every critical mineral on the critical minerals list. As our chairman mentioned earlier, it does no good if they stay in the ground. We've got to get them out of the ground. We've got to mine those resources, process those resources, and then ensure that we have the requisite storage of those resources in strategic reserves in the event that they become necessary for economic or national security purposes. And with that, I yield back.
The chair now recognizes Mr. Moore for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for inviting me to the hearing. I really appreciate it. It's one that comes from an energy state as well. So just want to start off here. So I'm from West Virginia. Obviously, we do coal, gas, and oil, so we do all three. And so in my entire life, I've watched our industries under attack. I mean, that's what's been going on, especially around coal. And so regulations have really been a primary driver in that, and as it relates to the fossil fuel industry. And so for 2025, you got utilities planning to retire 12.3 gigawatts of capacity, a 65% increase in retirement compared to 2024. And of that, you're going to see 4.7% of the total U.S. coal fleet get retired in 2025. However, as been pointed out here, the energy consumption in the United States from AI data centers alone could require as much as 14 gigawatts by 2030. So let me ask, the regulatory environment has continued to destroy the coal industry. FERC takes nearly 3 years to approve for large-scale infrastructure projects. What are the ways in which we can decrease the length of time for approval of this process? Anybody?
I can take that one,
Yeah,
Representative. I would say that we have little to no issues in permitting with interstate gas infrastructure. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission approves 99 point, close to almost 100% of the projects that's before it. And these are large, complex projects. and they complete an environmental impact statement for the larger ones, as well as their jurisdictional authority over LNG facilities. Those, 99% of those get approved as well, and they sail their way through permitting. If we want targeted, smart permitting reform, we need to be thinking about interstate transmission lines. We need to be thinking about renewables.
Do you know how long it took to build the Mountain Valley Pipeline, Ms. Gibson? Do you have any idea?
I know that the Mountain Valley Pipeline likely never should have been built, Representative.
Yeah, it took 14 years. 14 years to build it. In a country where we built like the Empire State Building in 1 year and 45 days, it's a real tragedy what's happening in this country. And, you know, just out of curiosity here, Mr. Swedenham, this is your, just out of curiosity, I see, you know, maybe you're just focused on oil and gas, but I don't see coal mentioned in this at all. Why is that?
So I think the issue at the Energy Policy Research Foundation, we are focusing on oil and gas permitting, and I thought that was the primary focus of this.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Okay. Well, in any event, yeah, I just don't understand. I mean, and we've faced it. We have like 1,000 years of gas in West Virginia, and we can't build a pipeline in less than 14 years to get it out. And I'm just curious, since you are focused on that, maybe you could touch on that a little bit.
No, I think absolutely the permitting of pipelines is, it does take way too long. I don't agree that they get permitted in a timely manner. And we also saw the pausing of the LNG export facilities in the Biden administration, which was of great concern to potential importers in Asia of U.S. natural gas. But specifically with respect to pipelines, the inability to permit the interstate pipelines, the example of getting Marcellus gas up to the Northeast, would greatly lower energy prices for consumers.
All right, thank you. I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes Mr. Stauber for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Before I begin my second round of questioning, I would like to ask unanimous consent to enter into the record from the USGS the Figure 1, the role of non-fuel minerals commodities in the U.S. economy, estimated values of 2024. And it's this page in the book, Mr. Chair. With that being said, Mr. Jensen, you had talked about, you mentioned
Mr. Stauber, without objection, so ordered. Sorry about that, a little slow.
Mr. Jensen, you mentioned the all of the above energy strategy. I couldn't agree with you more. And then the best will rise to the top, right? So wind and solar may work in different parts of our nation, but don't force northern Minnesota, who's going through a snowstorm right now, to depend on energy that's not reliable, that's intermittent, not affordable. So I love your comments about all of the above, and I would add the best will rise to the top. Mr. Swedenham, you had talked about, you had mentioned that about the critical minerals and the Chinese dominance. In the Congo, there's 15 of the 19 industrial mines are owned by the Communist country of China. And even the Biden administration agreed with this statement. 33% of the cobalt that comes into the United States is mined by child slave labor out of those mines. So with that being said, I wanted to, you had mentioned there's people are okay driving their EV vehicles or their green technology, as long as it doesn't come from our country. I had heard a term last week called, we're exporting our environmental guilt. We're exporting our environmental guilt. We're okay saying we've got, everything's green, we want green technology, et cetera. Yet we turn a blind eye when the Biden administration agrees with a memorandum of understanding to bring the cobalt here. Ms. Gibson, you cannot agree with that. Can you?
Of course, I condemn child labor. We condemn child labor. I'm a mother myself.
I agree with you. And Ms. Gibson, in northern Minnesota, we've been mining for 145 years. The cleanest water comes right from the ground in the heart of mining country. Would you rather the Minnesota miners, under the best environmental standards, the best labor standards in the world, mine that cobalt so we can use in our country rather than getting it from communist country of China using those poor labor conditions? Yes or no?
Again, of course.
Thank
we
you.
condemn
Ms. Gibson,
child
do you know how,
labor.
Ms. Gibson, do you know how long on average it takes to open up a mine from exploring to mineral extraction? Do you know the average time it takes to open up a United States mine? I'll give you a hint. I'll give you a hint. It's not 30, and it's more than 28. Can you imagine that? The only country that takes longer is Zambia. Here we are. We have a strategic national security issue in this country, and we talk about permitting. Let's get it done for all industries, as Mr. Jensen said. When we do that, we can hold the security of this country in the palm of our own hands. The only state that has more mineral wealth than Minnesota is Alaska. And the Biden administration put more sanctions on that state of Alaska than they did Iran. Unbelievable. So we have an opportunity, not only this committee, but the Natural Resources Committee, to extract the minerals here under our labor status. We are blessed with the abundance of these natural resources. Let's do it right, and let's lead the world. I'll be damned if I'll let China control the destiny of this country. When we know better, we do better. Mr. Swedenham, you give the example of China and the Japan example. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine that? We are at the crisis point in our nation as far as strategic national security, not only on energy, but critical minerals. We must secure our nation's strategic national security by mining them here, using the American labor, American technology, its American communities, for American economy. This is the fight of the 21st century, in my opinion. Energy and critical mineral dominance. And there's not a country that's set up for in the world but the United States. I yield back.
The chair now recognizes the ranking member Dexter for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. And I very much appreciate the passion of this argument and the discussion we're having here today. I also want to just make it very clear that Ms. Gibson is here for a certain testimony, certainly not to condone any of the things that was just brought up by my colleague. I also want to just mention that despite the ongoing improvements in safety for miners and other occupations that, and despite Minnesota's high-quality protections, the Iron Range mining in Minnesota has 3 times the rates of mesothelioma than is expected. And as a lung doctor, I've taken care of patients with mesothelioma from time of service, from mining. Certainly black lung and silicosis are things that we see. These are the costs of doing mineral mining, in addition to the asthma, fires, and smoke exposure that we put people through with our refineries, with our oil production. We do not take into account the human impacts of these challenges. And so I just want to make it also clear, there were some questions about subsidies, and the International Monetary Fund estimates there's approximately $754 billion in indirect subsidies in the US every year for oil and gas production. And the IRA, I'm just going to ask you, Ms. Gibson, did the Inflation Reduction Act provide subsidies indefinitely for renewable energy?
No, Dr. Dexter.
Thank you. I would agree with that. I think we certainly have subsidized oil and gas production. In fact, we have abandoned mines and different infrastructure across this country. And a stranded asset is an investment that loses value or becomes unusable before the end of its expected useful life. And in the energy context, that could mean we build a new methane gas plant and finance it over 40 years, but we can't use it after 10 years because it's cheaper to use renewable energy. And that is the trajectory that we are seeing as we continue to improve the technology for renewables. Maybe we require it to be shut down to deal with a climate emergency. These are costs that I believe are not being taken into account in these amazing numbers that we are being convinced of today. I wanted to ask Mr. Daratna, sorry if I did not say your name correctly, does the model that you reference in your testimony account for the economic risks of stranded fossil fuel assets as the world continues to pursue decarbonization efforts?
I'm sorry, the question was about the risks of stranded fossil fuel assets?
Just the economic risk. If we are building these methane plants or CO2 capture plants and then we strand them, as we know this is happening across the country, there's stranded infrastructure that then has to be cleaned up by the government because the industry is not doing that. Is that something that has happened in the past?
The Energy Information Agency's National Energy Modeling System, I believe, that they do not incorporate for that. But at the same time, I think what you're getting at, okay, well, anyway, go ahead.
No, please.
No, I was just going to comment on broader questions regarding the public health questions that I think you might be getting at, that I think you suggested were not incorporated in the analysis, which I'm happy to address.
So let's talk about the stranded infrastructure. As we are building, we're talking about taking diesel turbines off the coast of Puerto Rico and other things that have to be created because there's a shortage, correct? So if we create infrastructure and it is abandoned, is that cost accounted for? Because we have a history of doing that throughout this country. There's stranded oil wells across this country, correct?
So between the business as usual case and the high oil and gas case in the simulations that I had discussed, as well as the carbon reduction simulations, those variables were all considered equal between the cases. So I don't think I think it's like comparing apples and oranges to ask a question like that, to be honest.
So you don't think it's relevant that we subsidize
when
the
you're
development
computing
of
the
this
deltas,
infrastructure?
Excuse me?
When we are subsidizing the development, and with infrastructure, there's tax deductions, we are certainly
I see your question. My personal opinion is that there shouldn't be subsidies, period, whatsoever in the marketplace, if that's what you're asking.
I appreciate that perspective, and with that, I'm over time, so I yield back. Thank you.
The chair now recognizes himself for 5 minutes. Mr. Swedenham and Mr. Jensen, I just want to make a comment on both of you when you're talking about speeding up permits. And one of the reasons I came to Congress is the fact that you have got excess litigation going on out there that is actually harming and making permitting extremely long. And until we get control of these nuclear verdicts, these environmentalists that are out there that have no skin in the game, that are just suing to sue to hold up projects, until we get them, make them accountable and make them pay for that, then you're going to see continued permits to drag on and on for years. We need tort reform in this country. We need it on a federal level to make these people accountable. And as a matter of fact, you know, if they want to go somewhere to have their trade, go to China. That'd be a good place for them to start, because we are the cleanest right here in the United States of America. With that, I want to climate change a little bit. Ms. Gibson, you mentioned moving away from conventional forms of energy in order to curb climate change. Can you cite the actual impact on global temperature as a result of moving toward an American energy portfolio heavily, and if not exclusively, then dependent on renewables, you know, as you were talking about in your testimony?
Well, I'll just respond to some things that Dr. Daratna said.
Well, I would appreciate
earlier.
if you would answer my question. I've got a number of questions, but can you cite the actual impact on global temperature as a result of moving toward your renewables?
Well, I'd say even the number that was given by the doctor earlier, even with very generous assumptions for the fossil fuel industry, is bad news all around and doesn't take into account our collective responsibility.
But can you cite the actual impact of moving towards your renewable? That's what I'm asking. I'm not asking for you to respond to anything that Dr. Daratna said. It's just a simple question that you have in your testimony. You said
I've increased.
You said it was going to change. I'm just asking you how much. What's the actual impact on the global temperatures?
The actual impact on global temperatures,
Yeah,
I
what's it
think,
gonna
I
do?
think it's very well established at this point that increased harmful weather events that will impact not only our energy infrastructure,
All right.
but our
It
communities.
was a number question, but that's okay. Dr. Daratna, as we just heard, some claim that increasing drilling here in the States is going to exacerbate climate change. That's essentially what Ms. Gibson in her testimony was talking about. Does your modeling at Heritage offer any estimates of this? And what policies seeking to reduce carbon, what about the policies that are seeking to reduce the carbon emissions? And you got any response to the no response?
Yes, sir. Again, we use the model for the assessment of greenhouse gas-induced climate change, which is not our model. It is a model by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And taking into account the increased emissions from the high oil and gas case, which again, they are not our assumptions. These are the Energy Information Agency's assumptions about a high oil and gas scenario. Using overly sensitive assumptions about the climate, there would be no more than a 0.03 degrees Celsius temperature increase by the end of the century. Now, if you go in the other direction, which I think was the second part of your question, about reducing emissions through carbon-based regulation, if the United States were to completely abate fossil fuels starting today, there would be less than 0.23 degrees Celsius temperature mitigation by the end of the century, again, assuming an overly sensitive climate. You could play with our model online. It's the Heritage Foundation Climate Calculator, where you have all these assumptions and you could play with them. And these are considered the most extreme assumptions about the climate.
Good. Thank you. Thank you. That's all the questions that I have, so I'm going to yield back. I want to thank the witnesses for their valuable testimony and the members for their questions. The members of the committee may have some additional questions to the witnesses, and we will ask you to respond to these in writing. Under Committee Rule 3, members of the committee must submit questions to the subcommittee clerk by 5 p.m. on Monday, April the 7th. The hearing record will be held open for 10 business days for these responses. If there is no further business.
Actually, Mr. Chair, I wanted to ask for some records to be submitted into the, okay. So I'd just like to introduce for the record a paper that, thank you, Mr. Chair, paper that estimates the value of stranded assets in oil and gas infrastructure in the U.S. under a scenario in which climate change mitigation limits warming to 0.2 degrees Celsius by 2100. Or 2 degrees Celsius, not the change. Sorry, this estimate puts the value at around 300 billion, and we have two other documents I'd like to submit for the record. So thank you, Mr. Chair.
Without objection, so ordered. So if there's no further business, without objection, the subcommittee stands adjourned.
Good meeting you.